New Orleans, the most haunted city in North America. Between devastating events of its past, coupled with the spiritually charged environment of its people, New Orleans has become the perfect breeding ground for paranormal activity. However, these paranormal stories, they do sell. So you may or may not be surprised to learn that some of these stories are embellished, and some aren't even true at all. Today, I bring you 3 infamous ghost stories of New Orleans and their true story, or lack thereof, in this episode of Historical Haunts. Tragic and heinous stories are often embellished through the generations. But why is this? Well, human nature. Before the invention of TV and movies, we had gossip to entertain us. The more lavish a story, the more entertained the listeners were. And in New Orleans, regardless of what stories are true or not, it has a reputation. From a tragic history of death, destruction, and unsolved mysteries, to a mixing of cultures and occult spiritual practices, New Orleans is brimming with the energy of the past and present. The energy there is so odd, a lot of visitors will tell you that they often feel strange feelings when they're wandering through the streets. Just an eerie feeling, like something isn't normal. And this is why tall tales have thrived there. So, let's get into today's tales. For these 3 haunting stories, I'm going to tell you the full tale that is told today. Then I will expose the truths and lies behind each one. A side tangent here, some of these stories can get pretty gruesome, but I'm going to try to fit within YouTube guidelines. This video might not make it past the guidelines. Alright, let's get started. Tale number 1. The Sultan's Palace. It was in the 1860s when it happened. It all started with a grand procession from a boat through the French Quarter. The local residents watched in awe as a large group of women dressed in the finest Turkish silks and jewels walked past St. Louis Cathedral and down Dauphine Street into the beautiful Gardette La Prette house. The mansion, situated on the corner of Orleans and Dauphine, had amazing views from the wrought iron balconies that adorned the entirety of the building. Following the large group of women looked to be bodyguards and family members. Locals said that the women were a harem. Coming up the rear of the group was a sultan from Turkey, Prince Suleyman. The people watched as furniture and other items were loaded into the home. But the odd thing was, once that door shut, locals never saw it open again. No one came or went from the mansion, but every night the people in the area would hear the sultan's exotic music, and they would smell burning opium in the evening breeze. One night, there was a huge storm that hit New Orleans. It kept everyone indoors as it was too dangerous to be outside. Once morning hit and the storm cleared, a young boy who was tired of being cooped up ran out into the streets to enjoy freedom again. He happened to be passing by the mansion, where he saw the door was opened and blood was trickling down out of the house and into the street. The boy quickly ran and grabbed the police. What the police found was so disturbing, many had to leave for fresh air. Some were openly sick, heaving their stomach contents onto the street. It is said the bodies inside were in multiple pieces. Things from inside the bodies were strung up in chandeliers and along staircases. Essentially, there was a mess everywhere. And after searching the home, they couldn't find the Sultan's body. Eventually, they made it into the backyard. They saw a hand sticking out of the dirt. And there they found him, the Sultan, buried alive in the backyard. So, what a horror story, huh? Well, would you be surprised to find out? It isn't even true at all. People still tell the story to this day, and they even say things like they see bodyguard ghosts wandering around, or they see the ghosts of what happened play over and over again inside the home. But there's an issue here. There was no sultan that came to New Orleans. In fact, during that time, Turkey wasn't even Turkey. It was the Ottoman Empire. So there was no Prince Suleyman even around to come to New Orleans. The only newspaper coverage of this story is from 1979 in the Times-Picayune. The article says that the event happened in the middle of the 19th century, yet there's no other articles in press archives from that time period of this happening. There's no records in any police reports either. And there's no records of any bodies being buried by the church or shipped away to be buried back home. The other thing that completely disproves this story is apparently there was an earlier version of the story that was published by local historian and novelist Charles Garay in 1867. In his book, History of Louisiana, Charles said the events played out in 1792, which unfortunately predates the actual building of that house at that location. So this whole story is a hoax or urban legend. But by 1922, the legend of the massacre stuck, and it became cemented as one of Louisiana's most horrific stories. However, that being said, the Gardet's La Prete house is actually haunted, just not by the ghosts of the Sultan and his harem. Before the mansion was built, the site was home to a very small brick and wood dwelling dating back to 1780. This was owned by a free woman of color named Victoire Durlit. She sold it in 1811 to Francois Darby, who reportedly lived there until her death in 1816. In 1835, a dentist named Joseph Coulon Gardet tore down the small brick and wood house and built the big mansion. In 1839, it was sold to a merchant, Jean-Baptiste Le Pretot, who owned it until 1878. And he was the one who actually installed the cast iron balconies, and that was around 1850. And all of this can be corroborated in Historic New Orleans' collection of records. Now, this story comes into play where people said that he rented his house out to the Sultan. However, like I said, there was no Sultan. But why did I give you a little bit of a background of the house? Well, one of the ghosts that haunts the place is actually a Confederate soldier. So it's possible that it's linked to the original small home that was built there in the first place. Or maybe the soldier just died on that piece of land before anything was built. Now I'm going to give you some real accounts of the hauntings that have taken place there. In 1966, the building was purchased by Frank D'Amico and Anthony Vasish Jr. They turned it into apartments. In 1979, Frank's wife, who was living in the penthouse of the apartment building, one night she came to bed. She said that she saw a huge dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. It began to move towards her, and she ran to turn on the light. And as the light came on, the figure vanished. Another tenant, Nina Nevins, experienced items going missing, but nothing too intense. One tenant, however, had his dog shoved down the stairs by an unseen hand. Other tenants encounter strange smells, tapping noises, footsteps, and disembodied voices. And many people have seen shadowy figures in the corner of their homes. But the ghosts that have been most often reported there are a Confederate soldier and a woman. So, tell me below, what do you think of this story? Have you ever visited the Sultan's palace? Story number 2, LaLaurie Mansion. Before we begin this story, I will just give a little bit of a trigger warning. The story does involve the poor treatment of slaves back then. If you don't wish to hear this story, I do have chapters in this video and you can skip past. Let's begin. I will just point out the LaLaurie Mansion and Miss Dauphine from this story played a big part in the American Horror Story franchise. But no, they did not film at this house. One night in 1834, in a beautiful mansion on Royal Street on the edge of the French Quarter, a party for high society members was interrupted by the smell of smoke. And very quickly, it began to spread as the house was getting caught up in flames. The lady of the house, Dauphine LaLaurie, began begging people to help her move her valuables out of the house and protect them. But onlookers were more concerned about her slaves, and they told her that they should be getting the slaves out first. She ignored the request and continued asking people to help her move her furniture and her things. Soon the fire brigade came, and when they went inside, they found a slave chained to the stove in the kitchen, and that's where the fire was originating from. The slave, barely able to speak, just said the word attic. The firemen went up to the attic, but it was locked. They went back out and asked Lady Dauphine for the key, but she would not give it to them. So they went upstairs and broke down the door. Once they got inside, they saw the horrors that Dauphine was trying to hide. There was a smell of death that came billowing out of the room. Her slaves were found chained up, disfigured by their owner, and experimented on. Skin was peeled back, exposing the tissue. One had a hole drilled into their head, a spoon sticking out of it. It is said to stir his brains. And lastly, that there were performing SUL changes to them. It seemed that many of them were the subject of improvised medical procedures. There were thousands of residents watching the fire, and they all witnessed what Dauphine and her husband, Louis Leonard LaLaurie, a physician from France, had done to the slaves. The slaves were immediately brought to the hospital, and it said either one or two of them passed away. People had heard about how cruel Dauphine was. She was once even investigated for the treatment of her slaves. Between her cruelty and her husband experimenting on them, a lynch mob developed in the city, and people demanded Dauphine and her husband be put to death. The mob went in and destroyed her home and destroyed all of her things while she and her husband escaped. It was rumored that they ran off to St. Louis. However, it was also rumored that they returned back to New Orleans under false identities and lived out the rest of their days there. The house was eventually rebuilt and had many lives after. It stands as one of the most haunted locations in New Orleans. But as with many of the ghost stories of New Orleans, not everything in the story is true. So, what was made up? Well, the story did happen versus the last story that didn't happen at all. But it got more gruesome as time went on. I added in all the details of all future retellings of the story into one story. It was sort of a big viral story at the time. It made it in multiple papers across continents, and as people were retelling it, some were just reposting the original articles, but some were retelling it and putting different spins on the story. So it got pretty embellished. And the biggest thing that got embellished was the details of what happened to the slaves. The slaves were treated very poorly, yes. It was pure neglect, starvation, and abuse. Dauphine was already investigated once for the treatment of her slaves because there was laws in place back then for the proper treatment of them. However, to be fair, everyone who owned slaves at this time were cruel to them. They just did it behind closed doors, and their houses don't burn down and open up to the rest of the world of what they've done to their people. Because, these people still own slaves, so they're not good people. However, it was customary for the slaves in the city to be well kept. People didn't want to look at ones that looked sickly. The sickly ones belonged on the plantation. This is why Dauphine was already investigated once before, because her slaves were malnutritioned. So, the whole story is still an absolute horror show, and she was not a good person. But it was just this happened that thousands of people were in the streets and witnessed it all. On top of her not wanting to give the key to the attic, it seems it made people actually act like human beings for once and get angry about the treatment of slaves for just a short time. There is an existing article from the New Orleans Bee on April 11th, 1834 that described what the people saw. There was already some embellishment happening in this article, and even you can see from where this article started and from where the story ended up, you can see how the embellishment kind of grew. The article says, 7 slaves, more or less, horribly were seen suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. These slaves had been confined by the woman LaLaurie for several months in the situation from which they had thus providently been rescued, and they had been merely kept in existence to prolong their suffering. So, parts of the article are true. They were just kind of kept alive or kept existing very slightly. But they weren't being suspended by their limbs, and there wasn't limbs torn off. They were just heavily malnutritioned, starved, and obviously used by her as well. Now, the other lie in this story is that the doctor was experimenting on them, but that wasn't the case at all. Louis LaLaurie had nothing to do with the crimes. In fact, he and his wife had been fighting so much, everyone knew that he and his wife had been fighting a lot. It was all over town. And prior to the day of the fire, Louis actually had moved out into bachelor's holdings in a different part of the French Quarter. So he wasn't even living there anymore. He never actually ran off with her. That is also part of the lie as well. So he filed for divorce, separation from her. Also, she actually ran away to Paris and not to St. Louis, but she died in Paris and her body was exhumed and brought to St. Louis because her son wanted her buried near him. So that's where some of that confusion comes from, which is understandable. But the doctor actually moved back into the French Quarter and he thrived there and nobody had a problem with him. But over the generations, once the people that knew him had passed on and so forth, the story ended up evolving to say that he was doing medical experiments on them. Now, the place is very haunted. There was a lot of trauma that happened there. There was one of the slave girls that did die. She apparently accidentally fell off the roof while she was running away from Dauphine, and supposedly a neighbor witnessed this, but they then also witnessed her burying the girl's body in the backyard, but the bones weren't found till after the fire, so I don't think the story of a neighbor witnessing it actually happened. Now, the building was turned into apartments after, and because of the stories, a lot of the tenants saw an opportunity to make a little bit of money. So they would charge people, like this is back in the day, they would charge people like 5 cents or something to come into their apartment and check out the haunted apartment. But to keep up appearances and to make it more creepy, and the tenants were all trying to make money off of this, some of them would actually dress up in sheets or they would drag chains on the floor. So they were actually making a little bit of a spooky experience, but it was faked. That being said, like the place is haunted. It's just there was a lot of embellishment in the story that happened. And then on top of tenants faking events, paranormal events, and this has muddied some of the stories that come out of this place. You could say that this building has some negative energy in it because in 1894, a tenant who lived in the apartments was actually found brutally unalived in his room. They found his things everywhere and as if someone went through them, but nothing was stolen. The odd thing about this story is that the neighbors said that he kept complaining of things going missing and that there were sprites living in his house. But then he also then told one of his friends that there was a demon there that wasn't going to rest until he met his end. So it's a bit of an odd story. I don't know how much that is really true. And that being said, I tried to do a bit of research on some of these stories and I couldn't find any reports or any news articles about a death that happened in these apartments that year. So I don't know what's really true there. What is interesting as well, this is an interesting story. We don't know if this is true because people have said this is all stories that have been passed down by people who were there. At one point, this building became a girls' school. It was the mid to late 19th century. And at first it was one of the few mixed schools in New Orleans, but politics, etc. happened, and eventually this became an African-American only primary school. Shortly after opening, and shortly after everything was going, the girls were actually showing up like bruises on their arms and things like that and saying that they were attacked by a woman. And some people believe that it was Miss Dauphine because they think, oh, how would these girls know about this story? They're so young. The story is very famous in New Orleans. So some people think that they were doing it to each other and they were just trying to freak out the teachers, which is totally possible as well. So again, this is something that cannot be substantiated, but it's going to be part of the story that you might hear as well. But tell me, what do you think? There was horrible things that happened here, and there were people that were hurt here, so I do imagine that it probably is haunted. If anything, it's got enough negative energy on it that it could attract other things as well. But leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Now, let's get on to the last story. Story number 3, the Ursuline Convent. This story is a fun one. It's about vampires. It is said that even to this day, there's a group of vampires that live on the 3rd floor. So let's get into it. This story goes all the way back to the 18th century. The city's founder, Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne Bienville, was in need of suitable women to marry to the male settlers in New Orleans. He wrote a letter to King Louis in France asking for proper women to come over to marry, and his request was accepted. A few months later, a group of women arrived at the port of New Orleans. The women looked very pale. Their skin was apparently like shining under the heat of the sun, so they looked a little bit off. Additionally, it said that they carried all their belongings in luggages that were shaped like caskets. They were actually nicknamed the Casket Girls. So they were all taken to the Ursuline Convent, where the nuns would watch over them until their weddings could be arranged. The caskets were put in the 3rd floor of the convent and left there even after the girls were properly wedded off. And this is where the story takes an odd turn, because it said that the casket girls brought something with them that was undead. Apparently, the caskets were put in the 3rd floor of the convent and left there even after they were wedded off. When the nuns went up to retrieve the suitcases, no items were found inside. Then quickly, the people of the French Quarter realized vampires had been turned loose to prey on their citizens. There were multiple deaths at the time, and they were all attributed to these vampires, these undead creatures. Even after that time, there were stories of vampires attacking people near this convent. In 1978, a pair of journalists and paranormal enthusiasts camped out at the grounds of the convent. They set up cameras to watch the door because it was said that at night the door would fly open and out would come the vampires. So they had their cameras trained on the doors and windows to watch and see if the vampires would show up. Sometime in the middle of the night, their cameras just stopped rolling. And when people wandered by there in the morning, they found both men passed away and their bodies were completely drained of blood. So, interesting story, is it not? Obviously, there isn't a group of vampires living in the convent, but the place is actually haunted. There's different tales of people seeing like shadows and faces and stuff into the windows. But again, it was a convent, so there was probably some stuff that happened there that attracted some energies. So there's probably some leftover spirits and whatnot. But let's get into a little bit of fact checking here. So first of all, you can go and do paranormal investigation there, but the third floor is locked off. No one's allowed up in the third floor. This just adds to the mystery even more. What is on the third floor? Apparently, they say just archives. So it might be archives and records. We don't know really, but if you're familiar at all with like the laundries and asylums and church-sponsored places like that, there could be records that they don't want released to the public. There could be things that happen there. Maybe that's why the place is haunted, because there isn't really any details on like why the place is haunted other than this story. So that is a little bit of a mystery, and I'll let you tickle your brain and decide what you want to do with that. Now, as for the original story, the casket, it wasn't the word casket. It was the word cassette. And it actually stood for a small box or a chest, and it held like jewels. So the girls were probably carrying small things that had jewels and other things like that, probably their dowry. So when they went up to retrieve them and the boxes were empty, probably so. It was probably jewels and other things that was their dowry that they gave to their husbands that they wed. So they may have been called the cassette girls when they landed, but people somehow through the ages, it got translated into casket. Casket wasn't even a word that wasn't really used until the mid-19th century. And that's when it started being included as part of burials of the dead. And when these girls arrived, that was far before that time. So casket wasn't even a popular word. But it being Creole, a mixture of Spanish and French, and probably a little bit of English mixed in, probably the word cassette got mixed up and then it turned into casket, and the story kind of built from there. Now, what about the journalist 1978? Well, I tried to do a lot of digging to find anything out because 1978 was not that long ago, so there should be records. And I could not find anything about two journalists or two people showing up with no blood and, deceased outside of this convent. I did find news articles about strangulations that were occurring in 1978, and it was a bunch of young men, and it wasn't anything to do with this convent. So the fact that I was able to find that and I wasn't able to find this story, I think it's very telling that this story isn't true. Additionally, in my research, I actually found someone on Reddit, and they said they were a junior at Ursuline in New Orleans in 1978. Nothing was mentioned or whispered about vampires anywhere. Like, this story wasn't even a thing. So then people question, well, where did the story come from? This goes back to one of my previous videos. I did a big video on vampires, which I'll link in a card up here. People believe that this story was kind of created or linked somehow with a story from Anne Rice's books. So it's very possible that that's how it ended up, because this person was around in 1978 and he said there wasn't even stories of vampires then. So it's very likely that this story is actually something that's somewhat new. Additionally, I did look into people who were trying to do research to see if there were that many deaths that occurred because of vampire attacks. The deaths should be recorded, because back then in New Orleans, when New Orleans first started, one of the requirements of the city was that you had to be Catholic. So every death, every marriage, every birth, everything was recorded through the church. And there wasn't a mass death that was recorded during this time, especially from like blood loss. The biggest mass death was the plague that New Orleans experienced, but we won't get into it in this video. So this story, not true. The building though does seem to be haunted. By what? Personally, I'm going to go on my thought process as it has something to do with it being a convent and probably something bad happened there. If you go and watch Bailey Saren's video on the laundries in Ireland, I think it's forever scarred me on things like convents and stuff like that, and like the things that could be happening behind closed doors that we don't realize actually happened back then. So, but that's my personal conjecture. I got no proof of any of it. These stories, quite interesting, very built up, very scary, some of them very disturbing. Why do they continue on? Well, they're part of the paranormal culture that exists in New Orleans, and that is big business. These stories, a lot of them are told verbatim like this by a lot of ghost tour companies. The biggest thing I would say to pull from this is if you're going to go to New Orleans, if you're going to do some ghost tours, do a bit of research and try to find ones that actually try to do research on these stories and try to be truthful during the tours. Because you don't want to leave the tour having completely fabricated stories from it. In my references, I've linked to a couple ghost tours that actually have done the research here and talked about these stories being false, so you can check them out if you are planning a trip there. As well, this week in the paranormal history video that's coming up, I'm going to be covering more of New Orleans, so that'll be a more detailed story of the city and how it was shaped by disasters, violence, mafia, the occult, voodoo, vampires, and more. I will also link that video at the end once it's released. What do you think? What do you think about these ghost stories? Do you have any stories of your own? Is there anything else in these stories that I missed? I'd love to know. Leave a comment below. If you've enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps build up the algorithm so I can keep working on more videos for you guys. I hope you enjoyed today's haunting stories.